Deep in the snow-laden forests of the Alpine region, where the air grows colder and the nights longer as winter approaches, villagers whispered of a creature that came with the season, a being as old as the mountains themselves. He was not St. Nicholas with his gifts and laughter. No, he was something far darker. They called him Krampus. The origins of Krampus are shrouded in myth, but the first recorded tales trace back to pagan rituals predating Christianity. In these ancient times, people worshipped nature and feared the spirits of the wild. One of these spirits was a horned figure with cloven hooves and a grotesque visage, said to dwell in the shadows of the forest. He came not to reward but to punish, dragging the wicked into the night with chains that clattered like thunder. In the 17th century, as Christianity spread through the Alpine regions, the Church sought to suppress the pagan rituals. But the image of Krampus was not so easily erased. Instead, he became a counterpoint to St. Nicholas, a symbol of the consequences of sin and disobedience. The villagers began to weave his story into the Christian narrative, creating the chilling dichotomy: the saintly Nicholas rewarding the good and Krampus punishing the wicked. But this story is not mere folklore. In the dark forests of Styria, Austria, a journal was found in the early 1800s, written by a traveling priest named Father Lucas. His accounts speak of strange happenings, children vanishing without a trace, and families waking to find claw marks on their doors. Lucas believed these incidents were the work of a creature he dared not name. On the 5th night of December, he wrote, "I saw it, horns like the devil, fur as black as the abyss. It dragged a screaming boy into the woods. I tried to follow, but the creature turned, its eyes glowing with hellish fire. I fled, my faith shaken, my prayers unanswered." Lucas's journal, now preserved in a museum in Salzburg, has become one of the earliest written accounts suggesting Krampus was not merely a legend, but something real. And though his story fades into obscurity, the fear of Krampus persists, his presence still haunting the December nights in small Alpine villages. But was Krampus merely a cautionary tale, or was he something more sinister? Something that could explain the countless disappearances and strange deaths recorded in the following decades. The fear of Krampus spread like wildfire through the Alpine regions in the 17th and 18th centuries. His legend grew beyond the whispers of villagers. He became a source of terror the Church could no longer ignore. The clergy declared him a manifestation of the devil himself, a remnant of heathen traditions that needed to be eradicated. By the mid-1600s, priests and monks conducted public burnings of Krampus effigies. Villages were ordered to destroy any artwork or idols depicting his horned figure. The Church's edicts labelled him a malevolent spirit of unholy origins, and those who invoked his name were accused of heresy. Yet, despite the Church's efforts, Krampus lingered in the minds of the people, his story too ingrained in their culture to vanish entirely. Secretly, some villagers still honoured the creature. These were the parents who hung small bells and bundles of birch twigs by their doors, not to ward him off, but to appease him. "Krampus is not evil," they would whisper. "He is balance. Where there is light, there must be shadow." One account dating back to 1682 describes a chilling event in the Bavarian town of Mittenwald. Father Gregor, a devout Jesuit priest, wrote of a December night when the church bells tolled without cause. When the townspeople rushed to the chapel, they found the doors chained from the outside. "Inside we found only devastation," Father Gregor recorded. "The altar desecrated, the crucifix shattered. In the pews sat dolls, crude and twisted effigies of the children in our village, and at the base of the altar a single message carved into the wood: 'He comes for the wicked.'" The church doubled its efforts to erase Krampus from history, but their mission met with strange and unexplained tragedies. In 1711, a group of priests travelling to Salzburg to condemn Krampus parades was lost in an avalanche, their bodies never recovered. In 1743, a monastery housing documents on pagan rituals, including those related to Krampus, burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. In a final, desperate act, the Church declared the Feast of St. Nicholas on December 6th, a holy day of obligation, hoping to overshadow the pagan traditions of Krampusnacht on December 5th. Yet in the remote villages, Krampus persisted. On that cursed night, parents warned their children to behave or risk the wrath of the horned beast. The Church could not stop the stories of the shadowy figure who punished the wicked and stole disobedient children. It was said he could not be banished, for he was not merely a creature of the forest, but a reflection of humanity's darkest fears and desires. As the centuries turned, Krampus evolved, his legend shifting with the changing times. But darker accounts, those of disappearances and grotesque sightings, kept surfacing, hinting that Krampus was more than a myth. What lay beneath the folklore? Was he a spirit, a demon, or something that predated human understanding of good and evil? As Krampusnacht approached, the Alpine villagers would huddle in their homes, their prayers a fragile shield against the clattering chains and guttural growls that echoed through the night. By the late 1800s, as industrialization brought change to even the most remote Alpine villages, Krampus seemed to fade into obscurity. The new generation dismissed him as a relic of the past, a story used by frightened parents to scare their children into obedience. But in the shadowed corners of the mountains, whispers persisted. The winter of 1892 was unusually harsh. In the small Austrian village of Gries, nestled deep in a valley, the snow piled so high it buried entire homes. Food was scarce and tempers were thin. It was during this brutal December that the disappearances began. The first was a boy named Matthias, just 6 years old. His mother swore she had tucked him into bed the night before, but by morning his room was empty. The window was open. Frost crystallized on the sill, though no footprints marred the fresh snow outside. The villagers scoured the woods, but their search yielded nothing but Matthias's scarf, tangled in a low-hanging branch. Then, 2 days later, a young girl named Clara vanished. Her father, a woodcutter, claimed to have heard the faint sound of chains rattling in the wind that night. He awoke to find their front door ajar and claw-like marks gouged into the wood. Panic gripped the village. Parents huddled their children close, locking doors and windows. Some whispered Krampus's name, their voices trembling with fear. Others dismissed the idea as superstition, but the disappearances continued. One family, desperate for answers, sought out the town's oldest resident, a recluse named Frau Engel. She lived alone on the outskirts of the village, her home filled with strange trinkets and bundles of dried herbs. Many believed she was a witch. Frau Engel told them of Krampus, of the creature's ancient hunger for the wicked. But Krampus does not merely punish children, she warned. He feeds on the despair of the guilty, the secrets they keep hidden in their hearts. She pointed to the birch rods hanging above her hearth. Hang these by your doors, burn incense at dusk, and if you hear the sound of chains, do not look outside. Krampus thrives on fear. A single glance is an invitation. The villagers heeded her advice, but fear continued to grow. One night, a young man named Johann, emboldened by drink, declared he would find the creature and put an end to the madness. He left with a lantern and an axe, trudging into the snow-covered woods despite the villagers' pleas. By dawn, Johann had not returned. A search party found his lantern shattered near the edge of a frozen creek. Scattered around it were strange, hoof-like tracks that began abruptly and ended just as suddenly. The tracks were enormous, far too large to belong to any animal known to the region. The disappearances ceased after that, but the villagers were left with a lingering sense of dread. Frau Engel claimed Krampus had been satisfied, for now, but she warned that the creature was not bound to Gree alone. Krampus moves with the wind, the snow, the season, she said. Wherever there is darkness in the human soul, he will find it. The events in Gree were never officially recorded, dismissed as the ravings of superstitious peasants. But in private letters exchanged between local priests and town officials, the accounts were far more detailed and far more disturbing. Whatever happened that winter, it left a permanent mark on those who survived. And in the years that followed, similar disappearances were reported across the Alps. Each time, the stories were the same: claw marks, chains in the wind, and tracks that defied explanation. But Krampus was no longer merely a local legend. He was becoming something else, something far more terrifying. A shadow that loomed over all of Europe, waiting for the cold nights to call him forth. As the 20th century dawned, Europe was changing. Railroads connected isolated villages to sprawling cities, and old traditions were traded for modern conveniences. But some legends refused to die, spreading along the very networks that were reshaping the continent. By the early 1900s, stories of Krampus were no longer confined to the Alpine regions. Reports of clawed marks on doors, chains clattering in the night, and children vanishing without a trace began to surface in neighboring countries: Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic. At first, they were dismissed as old superstitions, migrating with rural families seeking work in the cities. But then came the sightings. In 1910, a factory worker in Munich claimed to see a horned figure standing under a gas lamp on his street. The man described it as half man, half goat, with glowing eyes and the stench of sulphur. When the worker shouted, the creature turned and vanished into an alley, leaving behind scorch marks on the cobblestones. Later that year in Budapest, a mother reported hearing her daughter crying out in the night. When she rushed to the child's room, she found the girl pointing at the window, babbling about a monster with a long tongue. Outside, the snow was undisturbed, save for a trail of deep hoofprints that led to the edge of the Danube and then disappeared. These incidents gained traction in local newspapers, blending sensationalism with genuine fear. Scholars and folklorists dismissed them as hysteria, the result of parents telling their children cautionary tales that had spiraled out of control. But others began to investigate, including an Austrian historian named Dr. Emil Kapell. Dr. Kapell, fascinated by the resurgence of Krampus lore, spent years traveling across Europe, collecting accounts of encounters. In his 1919 manuscript, The Winter Demon, A Study of Krampus, he noted chilling similarities in the stories. Hoofprints appearing and vanishing in unnatural patterns, chains clattering as if carried by an unseen force, children reporting nightmares of being carried away in a sack. Most disturbingly, Dr. Kapell uncovered records of towns with inexplicable spikes in missing persons cases during December. In one German village, 6 children disappeared over the course of a single week in 1915. The only clue was a series of birch rods found leaning against the town's church doors. World War I brought its own horrors, overshadowing tales of a horned figure stalking the winter nights. Yet, as soldiers returned home, some brought their own accounts of Krampus. In the trenches, men whispered of a creature that roamed no man's land under the cover of darkness. One diary entry from a Bavarian soldier, dated December 5, 1916, described a chilling encounter. The frost bit at our flesh as we crouched in the mud. Then above the sound of gunfire, I heard it, the rattling of chains. I thought I was mad until I saw it. A figure loomed on the ridge, its horns silhouetted against the moonlight. I swear on my soul, it was no man. After the war, these accounts were quietly dismissed, buried under the weight of grief and recovery. But Krampus did not fade. The 1920s and 1930s saw a renewed interest in the figure, particularly in urban centres where Christmas traditions began to blend folklore with commerce. Krampus parades, wild processions of men dressed as the creature, clanging chains and waving birch rods, became popular spectacles in Austria and Germany. But even as Krampus was commercialised, darker stories persisted. In 1928, a train conductor in Prague reported seeing a figure on the tracks late at night. The man described it as a beast walking upright, its eyes glowing like embers. When he stopped the train and investigated, he found nothing but deep grooves in the steel rails. By the 1930s, the Nazi regime sought to suppress Krampus traditions, deeming them unchristian and inappropriate for the Aryan image they sought to cultivate. Yet even their propaganda could not fully erase the horned shadow. Krampus had spread beyond his alpine roots, becoming a symbol of something primal, something that could not be contained. No longer merely a cautionary tale, he had grown into a myth that defied explanation, a being that crossed borders, languages and cultures. And as the world teetered on the brink of another war, Krampus remained lurking in the darkest corners of winter nights, waiting for the unwary and the wicked. The world of the 21st century is far removed from the snow-covered villages where the legend of Krampus first took root. High-speed internet, urban sprawl, and modern skepticism have left little room for tales of horned demons dragging misbehaving children into the night. Yet Krampus has not disappeared. In the early 2000s, Krampus experienced an unexpected resurgence in popular culture. Movies, TV specials, and parades thrust the horned figure back into the spotlight. What began as a niche fascination with old-world folklore exploded into mainstream recognition. Krampus became a kitschy mascot for the darker side of Christmas, his image plastered on everything from greeting cards to ugly sweaters. But for every playful nod to the legend, there were those who warned against treating Krampus lightly. Stories began to surface, urban legends, perhaps, of people encountering something far more sinister than a man in a costume at a holiday festival. In December 2012, a family in Salzburg reported a terrifying experience. Their teenage son, Lucas, had mocked the Krampus tradition at a local parade, jeering at the performers and pulling off one actor's mask. That night, Lucas woke screaming, claiming he saw a horned figure standing at the foot of his bed. His parents dismissed it as a nightmare until they found scratches on his bedroom door, scratches that Lucas insisted weren't there the night before. The family contacted local historians and folklorists, desperate for answers. One expert warned them that Krampus's mythos had always been tied to respect or fear. The figure is not just a story, the expert said. It is a warning. To dismiss Krampus is to invite him closer. Similar incidents have been reported in recent years. In 2017, a hiker in the Bavarian Alps claimed to hear the sound of clattering chains in the distance. When he followed the noise, he found a clearing where the snow was melted in the shape of two massive hoof prints. He fled, leaving his gear behind, and swore never to hike alone again. In 2020, during the global pandemic, a strange trend emerged. Across Europe and even parts of North America, reports of eerie sounds, chains dragging, guttural growls, spiked in December. Paranormal investigators and folklorists debated whether the stress and isolation of lockdowns were fueling mass hysteria, or if something ancient was stirring again, feeding on the collective unease of humanity. Most unsettling are the stories that don't make the news, accounts shared in hushed tones on internet forums or whispered around fires. These stories suggest that Krampus is not just a symbol of punishment, but an entity with its own purpose. In 2022, a small town in northern Italy experienced a rash of disappearances in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Among the missing were two children, siblings aged 7 and 9. Local authorities attributed the vanishings to human trafficking, but villagers whispered of Krampus, pointing to birch twigs left outside the children's windows. When one of the children's backpacks was found in the woods, police noted an unusual detail. The straps were scorched, as if burned by intense heat. Modern skeptics argue that Krampus is nothing more than a cultural boogeyman, a scapegoat for the unexplained, and a metaphor for humanity's darker impulses. Yet, as Krampusnacht approaches each year, even the most rational among us might hesitate at the sound of chains rattling in the distance. What makes Krampus so enduring? Perhaps it is the primal fear he represents, the idea that for every act of kindness there is a consequence for cruelty. He is the shadow to St. Nicholas's light, a reminder that our actions have weight, and that in the cold, dark depths of winter, the line between myth and reality blurs. So when the snow falls heavy and the nights grow long, remember the ancient warnings. Hang birch rods by your door, burn incense at dusk, and if you hear chains clattering in the distance, do not look outside, because Krampus can see you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake. Thanks again for joining me here at Nightmare Theatre. Have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holiday. I'll see you again soon.